I've been thinking, what is a democracy? Is it elections? Is it having three branches of government? A free media? I mean, we certainly know what it's not. But we've been seeing more and more of a disconnect between the electors and the elected. We go to the polls, but increasingly it just feels like we're choosing the lesser of two or more evils.
Right? There's a lot of studies which show that because we don't actually know what individual candidates think about issues, we often end up voting along party lines because we know at least what the party as a whole is going to do or what the prime minister, the leader of the party, is going to do. But actual candidates who are going to represent our constituency or our ward, we don't actually know what they want, what they think.
How do we address this problem?
Right? So for most Singaporeans, and I think most people around the world, when you think of elections, what you want to know is, well, what is their position on the issues? And so that's where the idea of the citizens' agenda was born.
And it gets me thinking, what does it mean to be a citizen in a democracy? Is a democracy something we live under or something we actively participate in? And if so, then what does it mean to practice democracy? Let's be honest. For most people, election cycles are the only times we get to talk about political issues. In everyday conversation, it's much more likely to be asked, who are you voting for? Or who did you vote last time? Rather than being asked, what are your political beliefs? What issues do you care about the most in your country? But if political discussions and political action is limited to election cycles, then it makes it really convenient for political elites to limit our options, limit reform, and ultimately limit change. And they have multiple methods to do this, used both within and outside of election cycles. Number 1. During elections, both the media and the candidates focus on personality and not programs. 2. Because the candidates are running for a party, that means the issues that they do talk about get limited within whatever the party has decided it's going to talk about, and not necessarily what the people are most concerned about. And 3, the political elite really love to push party politics as the primary method to enact change. I mean, how many times have you heard, if you don't like the way that things are going, then you should join our party. Be the change you want to be. Change things from within. But does it really work that way? There's research that shows that this is a clear pattern of behavior used by political elites and dominant regimes to stay in power.
Through close analysis of Malaysian and Singapore politics over time, I argue that a linchpin to the extreme durability of electoral authoritarianism in these two states is their purposeful cultivation and maintenance of personalized partisan political machines, sufficiently, formally and informally institutionalized over time to shape political culture broadly. While structural manipulation, for example, gerrymandering or vote buying, clearly helps a dominant party continue to win elections, the real staying power of electoral authoritarian governance rests in the transformation of state-society relations.
And so while we wait for the next election, the political elite will have all those years to build connections, consolidate power, and maybe even change some laws that may affect the next election. Without active political action in between, elections are merely a safety valve for the citizens' frustrations without ever really leading to reform. The largest danger of this phenomena is that the citizens of a democracy become accustomed to expecting less, that the job of real change is left up to politicians or maybe some activists and NGOs. Isn't it ironic that in a democracy, a person has to be exceptional in order for their voice to matter? If you're not out there cultivating a career in party politics or risking martyrdom on the front lines of a political rally, then Too bad. It doesn't count. Back of the line, please.
My analysis of electoral authoritarian persistence encompasses the remaking of political culture over the long term, as citizens adopt the norms of political legitimacy and standards for accountability that dominant parties cultivate and to which opposition parties increasingly conform.
So, how do we actually go about returning power to the citizens of Southeast Asia? How do we empower them to make the change that they want?
That's where the idea of the citizens' agenda was born. Because how do we create coverage around elections that actually focuses on issues? And in order to do that, how do you determine what those issues are?
Well, first we gotta find out, what do Southeast Asians actually want? The Citizens' Agenda, or TCA, is made up of 4 stages. And the first is finding out what issues actually matter to Southeast Asians. Not what the media tells us matters, and also not what issues that political candidates or political parties have decided that they want to talk about.
We ask the people, right? What is the most important issue? What issue do you want the candidates to address as they fight for your vote? And we let people write anything. So what we do is we work with a professional survey company to get as representative a sample as possible of age, gender, race, and so on, right? Things which are relevant to a country. And then we collect all the answers. And the answers range from one single word, which is usually jobs, to 1,500, 1,600 words, essay-length answers where people go on in detail about all the things that they think are important. And people respond because this is their chance to really make their voices heard. What we do is we then sit down and we go through them and we try to summarize them into a list of issues and we try and simplify it. In every instance of the Citizens' Agenda, we've ended up with a between 23, 25 issues.
Now, with all these answers in hand, Stage 2 takes these answers and asks participants to rank them relatively in terms of importance. Of the issues that they have submitted, which are the ones that are most important to them?
We take those 22, 23, 24, 25 issues and go back to the public and say, please rank your top 5. And then we publish an article examining these the rankings of the issues. And here I have to stress these are relative rankings, not absolute rankings. But it then gives us an agenda about how people feel about these issues and how relatively important they are to them. Right. And we then publish articles analyzing, say, correlations between issues and age, issues and gender, and so on. And that's stage 2.
And once all of the data has been collected, then the third step begins, actually making information about these issues accessible to the public.
So stage 3 is then doing research, publishing about these articles. And New Narrative then, our strength is storytelling, and we release research articles, but also comics, videos, podcasts about these issues so that people can have all the important information about these issues, and most importantly, the factors which affect these issues, right? Because again, going back to the mainstream media, the coverage often on something like cost of living is, oh, my kopi is twice the price that it was last year. And then they will, send a reporter out to look at prices across the country or lament, interview people, how they're cutting back or whatever. But they don't really answer the question of why the price has doubled. What are the factors influencing it? Okay, is it global supply or is it domestic policy, right? Is it rent seeking? Is it extortionate pricing? Is it gouging? Is it a rise in taxes? The coverage is generally very superficial. So what New Narrative tries to do is really explain the factors which go into the rising cost of living. Right? The things that influence policy making, the things that influence prices, so that people understand some of it is in the government's control, some of it isn't, and the things which are in the government's control, how do we address, what are the trade-offs that are being made?
Often, media coverage around elections just focuses so much on the person running. Are they charismatic? Are they hardworking? Are they intelligent? We don't actually get to have conversations around their position on important issues.
It tends to focus very much on candidates, on personalities. It tends to focus very much on trivia, which candidate went to what breakfast meeting and did what, rather than focusing on the issues. Yes, because in Southeast Asia, again, we have very little press freedom, right? And so when the media covers these elections, they put out these narratives about how the incumbents, the government parties, the establishment parties, and candidates are all just good, nice people. It's a lot of fluff.
And even when we do, by virtue of having a political platform, they get to choose which issues that they want to talk about, not the people.
If you actually look at the issues in Singapore, for example, every election, the People's Action Party puts out a manifesto that is simply, the PAP has done well in the past, let's have more good years. But what are actually their policies? If you go and look at the manifesto, there's nothing.
And so comes stage 4. Once we've made all of the information about important issues available, we want to empower the citizens of Southeast Asia to actually advocate and fight for the change that they want.
Stage 4 then is discussion, engagement, empowerment, where we get people to come to our democracy classrooms to discuss these issues, right? To educate themselves, to empower themselves. And then from there, they can decide what their position is on these issues and what they want to see regarding these issues now that they have this information. And then they can go challenge politicians, political candidates, right? Policymakers about these issues. They can actually go out and employ a lot of different tactics, directly asking people as they campaign, but also writing in, gathering other people to talk about the issues, to educate and empower other people, right? To spread awareness about these issues, to spread understanding about the factors which influence them, so that we have a more educated electorate. We have an electorate which is better able to hold politicians and political candidates accountable.
Late last year, leading up to the Malaysian elections, I made a political explainer that talked about how under certain systems, change is inherently discouraged. Essentially, these systems protect the dominant political party by ensuring that any newcomer and radical new politician eventually has to assimilate to the existing institutional and political culture. Either they adapt to these existing rules or they risk being sidelined politically. This type of institutional capture dilutes any radical new ideas or new strategies. You see, we want to equip citizens with the tools to organize, strategize, and train each other. This allows the people to organize and build power outside of the political machines that force us to conform to the status quo.
In a mature society, we can talk about important issues and we trust that we will be able to have mature discussions about them with each other. But in Southeast Asia, very often, as we talked about earlier, politicians tell us not to think about these issues, but they also threaten us and make us fearful that mentioning these issues will get us in trouble. But people are afraid, they're confused, and as a result, they're not practiced in the normal praxis of democracy, which is just at the very fundamental level, talking about an issue with mutual respect. Lastly, what I observed was people who came again and again and again, right? So the group that participated grew throughout the week. We had more and more people. Of course, it was also dependent on the issue, but still what we saw overall was that people became regulars. They enjoyed it so much, they just came again and again and again.
When we empower the people to have their own discussions and build their own organizations, we ensure that there is an alternative to the political status quo. This is especially important when the elites already control so much of the media landscape and the existing political institutions and political parties. All this time, we're challenging them on their turf and on their rules.
Because the temptation for politicians to run things to their own benefit is overwhelming. We give governments a monopoly of power, a monopoly of violence, and a monopoly on policy making. What's to stop governments from then simply running things for their own benefit? And you see that a lot in Southeast Asia.
We know this because when the PAP lost 10 seats in the Singapore general election in 2020, they immediately passed new laws that targeted New Narrative and other alternative publications.
And so naturally, I think the People's Action Party government then saw us as one of, if not the main culprit. I think along with the Online Citizen Asia, the two of us as the main culprits for their election reverse. And so shortly after that, they then filed a bogus police report against us. This is the Attorney General's chambers. Then followed a very unpleasant year where I was interrogated by the police several times for 4 hours, around 4 hours each. I was attacked in the mainstream media. We were accused of illegal election activity, which was ludicrous because anything we did, the mainstream media also did, and in far greater quantities. At one point, of course, my home was raided, my personal electronic devices, my laptop, my phone were confiscated. And then a year after they had filed the police report, the government decided they weren't going to pursue it. The police dropped the charges. Around 3 days later, they introduced a new law in Parliament called the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, which sought to make it illegal for Singaporeans to have a relationship with foreign-funded entities. And that, of course, includes New Narrative. But we don't need to speculate because the Minister of Law and Home Affairs, K. Shanmugam, stood up in Parliament and said very specifically that this law is aimed at stopping organizations like New Narrative from interfering in our domestic politics.
Ultimately, the political class in Southeast Asia can only get away with as much as we let them. And yes, they've had years to build the connections and the institutions necessary to hold on to power. But remember, now we have the tools to build our own connections, our own institutions. Now we have the tools to dismantle their power.
I think that growing the citizens' agenda to encompass all the citizens of Southeast Asia will be our first goal and first challenge. And then to do it more regularly outside of election cycles. Ultimately, I would like to do it a lot more regularly, yearly perhaps, but that'd be something that I'd like to do because ultimately, I think it creates a very powerful feedback loop. People feel empowered, they learn about issues, they want to do more, and then they do more and it spreads and they change things and then the issues change, they influence how things happen. And and then we do it all over again so that we understand how things have changed.
So, what does it mean to be a citizen in a democracy? Well, that's up to us.